Hi, welcome to Neuroverse
A podcast hosted by Clara.
and Carolina, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond.
Today's episode is on the evolution of the human brain, which is just one of my favorite topics. I think that I could talk about this forever and ever. And there's so much to talk about. But what I really want to focus on in today's episode is what evolution can inform us about the brain and neuroscience research and how it is crucial to always take evolution into account.
Yes, definitely. Especially because we use mainly, well, a lot of the times we use animal models in our research.
Yes, exactly. For example, both Carolina and I working on mice
Yes.
currently, and yeah, it's obviously there's a huge translational gap that may underlie the lack of translational value in drugs that work in mice but don't work in humans.
And especially noticeable in research that focuses on cognition. A lot of the times it's difficult to translate one thing into another, such as language or spatial awareness, which
Yes.
is what we are currently researching.
Definitely. And in fact, evolution may have created these higher cognitive functions that are somewhat human specific.
Yeah.
So it's those higher functions that are particularly difficult to study, like
Yeah, definitely.
the consciousness that we call our human consciousness.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
definitely interesting though because it also points to the fact that areas of the brain that are conserved through, years and years of evolution surely are like the most essential. And
Yes. But have they also changed,
yeah.
How, to what extent have they changed functionally? For example, one of the most conserved regions is the cerebellum,
Yes.
but recently there's been a surge of research highlighting new functions of the cerebellum, which historically is known to be involved in the control of movement and fine motor control. But now there's new studies finding it's related to satiation, hunger,
Okay.
as well as language.
A new paper came out in 2021 that showed that the cerebellum is involved in understanding the meaning of language, which is crazy because we used to think that the cerebellum at best could process, sound,
Word. Yeah.
and now we're understanding that it does so much more than that. And even though it's an incredibly conserved area, which I guess usually we associate with animals, it also has a lot of higher cognitive functions.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of brain regions, one of the most prominent regions that has evolved across species is the cortex, which is very, the prefrontal cortex is a very human specific area that's responsible for a lot of higher level functions like decision making and personality, etc. And it's so interesting how it's changed because it's not only so I was reading a paper about how over time the brain has increased in size.
Yeah.
That's a pretty obvious one. Well, it's not a direct relationship over time, but
Yeah.
human brains, for example, are bigger than mice brains. But the way that the cortex has developed has basically the way it's developed has basically been to overcome the problem of increasing size, because with increasing size there is the connections between different areas are over a longer distance. And so in order to maintain that connectivity, you have to find ways to overcome that. And one main way is to increase the amount of folding on the surface of the brain.
Wow.
Yeah, which there's still a lot of physical mechanical theories of cortical folding, but it's generally believed that it's a major mechanism that has enabled major cortical connectivity to enable brain regions to communicate despite the increased size.
Yeah, that sounds really cool.
Yeah.
I hadn't realized that. I mean, I knew that there were foldings in the brain, but I hadn't realized that they evolved specifically for that reason.
Yeah, and also it was made in a way that cortical there is an increased number. There's now an increased number of cortical microcircuits, so like local circuits and local processing, which is another way that they have overcome the problem of increasing size. And I just find it really interesting, the idea of like evolution, I think, is misunderstood as having a goal, you know?
Yeah.
But I don't think it really, I think it's more about, it's just constant problem solving.
Yeah, it's
so
constant
like,
trial and error.
Yeah, exactly. Biology presents problems, and because of changes in the environment and selection pressures, and then the result is actually just how that problem was solved. And so that is why, through understanding the process of evolution, we can understand more the selection pressures
and
that we
the function
face.
of the brain.
Exactly, why we have the functions. In a way, the cognitive functions that we have are merely a consequence of the environment that we live in.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Speaking of higher cognitive aspects of the brain and how it's evolved to be that way, this makes me think a little bit about David Attenborough's Green Planet documentary.
Yes. So good.
Yes. And in one of his episodes, there are these plants that grab onto other plants, and so that, well, when the other plants grow, they grow with them, and they're attached, and so they get the maximum amount of sunlight. And it almost makes it look like it's behavioral. You know, they know, well, quote unquote, they know that they need sunlight, and so they grab onto the tallest plants that will grow to get them the most exposure. But this isn't behavioral, this is all just evolution and trial and error. And it's kind of crazy how plants have evolved in such incredible, intricate ways. And it's just one example of how evolution is so incredible and just so specific and so well tailored to our survival.
Symbiosis again.
Yes.
As well. Maybe it just always tends towards symbiosis.
Yeah.
I have a really interesting example of this, which is so the way that the retina is organized.
Yes.
Is
I love the retina.
Yeah, it's actually, so weirdly enough, the retina is organized backwards. So light passing through into the eye has to get past like a whole layers of cells in order to reach the photoreceptors, which are the cells that actually respond to the light. And apparently the reason it evolved this way is just because, well, it always used to be like that.
Yeah.
And because the animals that, like our ancestors, didn't rely on vision as much as we do these days.
Oh, okay.
And so they just didn't receive much light, essentially. But when they started relying on receiving light as a form of sensory perception, you know, it was just too difficult for the retina to basically just turn around and invert itself.
Yeah.
So up till this day, it still remains like that.
Yeah.
And as I was reading about this, it reminded me of a really perfect quotation by a biologist, Dobzhansky, who said, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution."
Oh.
Light literally here.
Yes.
Figuratively.
That's a very good quotation.
Yeah, because again, coming back to the idea of problem solving, sometimes things in biology just really don't make sense.
Yeah.
And then you're like, you know, maybe it's just, it had to evolve that way.
Yes.
To survive. Yeah.
Do you think we could ever evolve to the point that the retina would function differently? That the light wouldn't have to cross all of those cells?
I suppose the cells, or whoever controls evolution, decided that it just wasn't worth it. Like, it wasn't necessary. You know, like, light can still pass through. And also, I mean, they still made changes. So the cells prior to the photoreceptors have become transparent so that the light can pass through. So it's still a change.
Yeah.
It's just not maybe a change that we would have thought of if we were in control of the process.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And another really important point is that because evolution has no goal, the point or the goal, I guess, of evolution, if you had to name one,
Yeah.
would be to diversify,
Okay.
like diversification of properties.
And survive.
Yeah, and survive. Well, I guess you could view diversification as like a product
Survival.
of evolution,
Yeah.
but also, yeah, it's part of the problem solving.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah, definitely.
you come up with
Without
more
variation.
It's creativity, essentially.
Yeah.
It's biology's creativity.
Without variation, like evolution would just stop. Like
Yeah.
everything would die. So yeah, you're right.
Yeah. And another thing I wanted to mention was neurons. So the brain has evolved as a whole entity, as we've discussed, like, for example, the cortex and brain regions.
Yeah.
But at the level of single neurons,
Yeah.
it is also thought that they have evolved.
That's so interesting.
And yeah, it's very new research. So it has to do with the biophysical properties of the neurons.
Mm-hmm.
And a recent paper by a lab at MIT
Yeah.
found that there are allometric rules for the development of specific neurons in the cortex.
Mm-hmm.
And this means that allometry means that the rule is size dependent.
Okay.
So basically different sized neurons in different species need different properties in order
Yeah.
to carry out the same function.
Mm-hmm.
And an example of this that they found is that ionic conductance, which essentially is just the amount of current that can pass through into a neuron, is altered based on the size of the neuron. So like
Okay.
larger neurons have a
Yeah.
higher conductance.
Yeah.
But the most interesting thing about this is that they found that human neurons have 4 times less conductance, so how much current they can pass through them, than expected by this allometric rule.
Oh.
Which is super interesting because that's almost paradoxical.
Yes.
But they
Did they spatulate why?
Yeah, they suggest that the reason is because human neurons sort of have more local processing of information, and so they don't need to, simply pass the current through.
Okay.
Because other processes within the neuron itself, which I'm not going to go into, can sort of amplify the information. And another reason as well they mentioned might be that through this lower conductance than expected, human neurons conserve more energy.
Okay.
So it's more efficient.
Yeah.
And this actually links to a previous paper published in 2019 by another group that explored efficiency versus robustness.
Okay.
So in human neurons, they labeled human neurons as being more efficient,
Yeah.
whereas they also studied macaques.
Okay.
And neurons in macaques they labeled as being more robust. And what this means is that macaque neurons basically responded to stimuli more reliably. So they had larger responses more often.
That's so interesting.
But then human neurons, they did not respond to the stimuli all the time. But this, in a sense, is efficiency because it's only responding when you need to. And so this could link to functional consequences at a larger scale.
yeah, that kind of also raises questions into predictive coding, like our next episode, right?
Yes, definitely. Which we'll talk about more in the next
Later,
episode.
yes.
Yeah, I find it fascinating the functional consequences that can come from the smallest scale of change.
And I find it like very interesting that the macaques were more robust at responding to stimuli. I really would not expect that.
Yeah. And another really cool thing, still about biophysics, is that it's also been found that human neurons have potentially, it's earlier stages in the research, but potentially have more computational capabilities. So as I mentioned, the other group speculated that there may be more local processing in human neurons. But yeah, for example, another type of, like a specific type of this local processing was found by another group, another research group, which was these calcium action potentials that are localized within dendrites, which are the regions of neurons that receive inputs. And this enabled essentially a computational function known as XOR.
Okay.
which is basically can amplify only inputs that are of low value.
Okay.
So it amplifies information that's of low value rather than high value.
What would be low value?
So less frequent inputs,
Okay.
or
Would it be like, I don't know, less like dangerous inputs? You know, like if you're in a situation of danger. No?
I can't answer that question.
Okay.
I don't know enough about it. But I think how this is implemented at a larger scale in terms of behavior is definitely an avenue to explore, but
Yeah.
I don't think we can make inferences just yet.
Yeah.
I think it's more the point that there is this capability that is specific to humans. And aren't we all just trying to find out what makes us human?
Yes.
Yeah. Another thing that I wanted to discuss was I came across the work of Paul Chizek, who's a researcher at the University of Montreal. And in one of his papers in 2021, he mentioned something that I found really interesting. He explained how new functional systems in the brain are gradually subdivided into finer and finer control systems. And so the normal way to conceptualize the development of new cognitive functions is to think of them adding on top of each other.
Yeah.
You know, but instead he's saying that the highest level of control is the most archaic ones. So the hypothalamic and the homeostatic systems, because they sort of form a basis and a foundation for new functions to emerge. And then he goes on to say that new systems emerge as adaptations of these old functions that extend control further into the world, which fascinated me so much because it sort of frames evolution as an evolving interaction that we have with the world around us.
Yeah.
And so this really made me question, are we, as evolved humans,
Yes.
simply becoming more in control of the environments that shape us in the first place?
Could you just rephrase that?
So in a way, we start off with the most archaic functions of hypothalamic, homeostatic control, you know, making sure our temperature is maintained, other stuff like that. And then from there, we sort of have this evolving relationship with the world that we live in which we sort of have more control over it.
Yeah.
So do you understand what I mean?
That's
so we evolve
interesting.
functions like how to navigate, how to make decisions, how to do things to live in the world.
Yeah.
Which I do really love thinking about it in this way because it's just, well, I guess symbiosis again.
Yeah.
It's evolving with the world.
That's so interesting how it's so like interconnected and intertwined, and like where one thing ends and one thing begins.
Yes, linked to individuality.
Yes.
And one last thing I wanted to mention was another interesting point which I hadn't considered before is another paper published in 2021 explored the concept of mental categories and phenomena as we view them, like we've been discussing, attention, emotion, memory.
Yeah.
And these are very widely known, talked about all the time, but this paper questioned and highlighted that these concepts in themselves come from scientific ideas about the mind from a very psychological background. And they don't necessarily fit all the time with what we look at in terms of brain activity, neural correlates, you know?
Yeah.
But they suggest that instead a more promising way to categorize and delineate the functional architecture of the brain is to view them through evolution.
Wow.
So instead of looking at these preconceived mental categories, we try to understand the regulation of behavior that drove brain evolution throughout its history.
Wow.
And with that, I think we can sum up this episode.
So interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you for exploring all of this stuff with evolution. I never, yeah, it's really opened up my eyes and seeing evolution in a slightly different light, and how it's, yeah, how it's like a bit of push and pull from like the external environment and like our own mental control or like brain control.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, are we having more control of our own evolution is the question to ask.
Yes, that's a very good question.
Which we'd love you to hear your ideas on. We'd love you to get involved. We hope you enjoy this episode, and please do share your thoughts on this topic with us.